Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're embarking on a really extraordinary journey, digging into some often unsettling history.
hmm
We're tracing the life of, well, a single molecule, lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD,
Right?
from its start as this promising Swiss pharmaceutical, then, its strange turn as a secret weapon, how it defined a whole generation, and now its potential return to the clinic.
It's a story just packed with contradictions, isn't it? It's
Yeah.
deep dive. We'll follow that molecule right from the sterile Swiss labs where it was first made
Okay.
into the absolute chaos of post-war Berlin's black market, then across the desks of CIA directors who are, frankly, obsessed with mind control.
Yeah.
And finally, bringing it right up to today into the modern neuroscience labs where, well, its potential is being looked at all over again.
And to really get a handle on just how bizarre this journey has been, I think we need to start with a very modern paradox, the really strange case of Leonard Pickard.
Oh, Pickard. Yeah.
His story just perfectly sums up how much society's view of this drug has, well, swung back and forth.
Pickard was probably the most prolific underground chemist out there in the late 90s. The sources we looked at suggest he was supplying maybe up to 95% of the world's LSD.
95%.
That's the figure. And get this, he was operating out of a place that just speaks volumes about the drug's history.
Okay.
A decommissioned nuclear missile silo in Kansas.
Missile silo. Wow. I mean, that's incredibly symbolic right there, isn't it? Tying the drugs straight to the Cold War.
Absolutely.
And he was apparently producing a kilogram of the stuff per month, given how tiny the doses are. It's almost impossible to push that volume.
It really is. A kilo translates to what, roughly 10 million doses?
1 million.
And Pickard, interestingly, he wasn't just some back alley chemist. He was a Harvard Kennedy School graduate.
Yeah.
So he brought a certain sophistication to this whole illegal operation.
And his capture, it reads like something out of a spy novel. Caught on Election Day, November 7th, 2000. What were the details there? It sounds incredibly dramatic.
Oh, it was pure Hollywood. Pickard was known for being extremely careful about security. But he spotted one tiny thing out of place. A gray Zen robe just left carelessly in a corner.
Uh-huh.
And he knew instantly the whole operation was blown. He bolts in his silver Buick, leads federal agents on a chase, and then he actually dives into the freezing Big Blue River
To escape.
to try and throw off the search dogs, mask his scent in the cold water.
Okay, so he gets across the river, but he's still got the feds and their tech to deal with.
Exactly.
Huh?
So he hides out for hours inside this massive concrete drainage pipe,
Right?
thinking, the concrete mass would shield his body heat from the infrared scanners the helicopters were using overhead all night.
Smart. Did it work?
It nearly did. But despite all that planning, the next morning a farmer's dog just stumbled upon him. He was arrested and later hit with 2 life terms without parole.
2 life sentences for making a drug. I mean, no violence involved, no theft. Arguably, given LSD isn't addictive, no direct physical harm in the usual sense.
That's the conviction. But here's the twist, the real paradox. Pickard, the guy deemed so dangerous he got 2 life sentences. He was granted compassionate release during the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic.
And that's the symbolic turnaround, isn't it?
Absolutely. And he didn't just vanish. He immediately pops back up as a scientific advisor for funds for companies working on psychedelic medicine.
You're kidding.
No, he's now guiding the development of the very things he went to prison for, advising universities, corporations internationally. It just perfectly shows this massive shift in how society and science are looking at LSD now.
So our mission, really, in this deep dive is to try and understand the flawed logic, as the sources put it, that kept these drugs out of therapeutic use for decades.
Mm-hmm.
We need to go back, look at how its history tangled up in World War II, the Cold War, how that sealed its fate as this forbidden substance instead of maybe a breakthrough medicine.
We also have to touch on its really troubling connections to, believe it or not, imported Nazi drug policy.
Right, let's get into that. Okay, so let's start our journey proper. Not in a lab, but in the rubble of post-war Berlin, 1946. This is really where the story of modern drug prohibition starts to take shape.
Yeah.
We meet Arthur J. Giuliani. He's a U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics agent, an FBN agent, and he's sent there to try and bring some order to the American sector.
And Berlin then, I mean, it was a blasted metropolis, as one source called it, truly lawless. Giuliani arrives, and regulations just mean nothing. The black market is king.
Right.
His predecessor literally called it the Wild West. You could get anything. High-grade pharmaceuticals, sure, but also prosthetic limbs. You could trade a Leica camera for a Hershey bar, apparently. A pocket watch for some margarine.
The sources mention this Russian word zapsarap, is that right?
Yeah, zapsarap. It means like taking something with a quick, sneaky motion. Constant theft, constant bartering. But the drugs themselves, they were flooding the place, salvaged from bombed-out medical depots.
And these weren't low-quality street drugs either.
Not at all. Pure pharma-grade stuff. Pervitin, that's methamphetamine. Heroin from Bayer. Cocaine from Merck. And maybe the most notorious, Eucadol.
Eucadol. That was the opioid rumored to be Hitler's drug of choice. Used heavily by the Wehrmacht, too.
That's the one. Highly potent, euphoria-inducing. So you had this potent mix just washing over the city.
Sounds like a recipe for disaster, public health-wise, and the stats seem to back that up.
Oh, definitely. Drug offenses apparently jumped 103% just in the first half of 1946. But Giuliani, his main worry wasn't just public health. He was fixated on the profits.
The money being made.
Yeah, he was utterly convinced that this flood of cash from smuggled narcotics was funding the Nazi underground. You know, remnants of the regime trying to finance a comeback, maybe even a Fourth Reich.
So his mission becomes intensely political, punitive.
Exactly. And he's looking around for a model, right?
Yeah.
How to set up a really strict, centralized drug policy for all of occupied Germany. And this is where we find that deeply uncomfortable link between American drug enforcement and, well, the Third Reich.
It's quite shocking when you read it.
It's profoundly disturbing. Harry J. Anslinger, the head of the FBN back in Washington, this guy had a nickname, Mussolini, because of his authoritarian style.
Mussolini, wow.
Yeah. And Anslinger openly admired the Nazi drug laws, the Rauschgiftbekämpfung, the fight against narcotics.
He actually called them stricter and said they had a better constitutional basis than our own for fighting drugs. And we need to be really clear here that Nazi approach involved sending drug users straight to concentration camps.
We absolutely have to be clear on that. And, you know, the sources also lay bare Anslinger's own prejudice. He's on record before Congress saying, and this is a direct quote, "Reefer makes darkies think they're as good as white men."
That's appalling.
It is, and it's crucial context, right?
Yeah.
It shows the kind of punitive, racist ideology underpinning American drug enforcement at the time, an ideology that was now being exported to Germany.
So Giuliani, in Berlin, he's got the green light for severity.
Yeah.
And he starts working directly with former Gestapo agents.
Yes. Specifically named are Werner Mittelhaus and Ackermann. He collaborates with them to build this new centralized anti-drug authority.
Using the Nazi structure as a blueprint.
Pretty much repurposing it. Giuliani was even using copies of old Gestapo forms for reporting drug offenses as templates for his new system. The aim was uniform, strict prohibition across all 4 Allied sectors, pushed through the Allied Control Council meetings.
But that plan hit a snag, didn't it, from the Soviets?
It did. Major Karpov, the Soviet representative, just consistently blocked Giuliani's efforts to impose this harsh, Nazi-inspired framework.
Why?
Giuliani wrote back to Washington complaining about downright sabotage on the part of the Soviets. He called Karpov a stodgy ideologist and said his opposition was just inexplicable perversity.
That's fascinating. So the American push for total control, fueled by Anslinger's harsh ideology, gets blocked by the Soviets. Giuliani called it irritating frustration.
Right. The seeds of the Cold War are already there, playing out in drug policy meetings in ruined Berlin.
And this political frustration, this drive for prohibition, it's really key, isn't it? Because while the U.S. is busy exporting this punitive model, the most powerful psychoactive molecule known is quietly being synthesized completely away from all this chaos in Basel, Switzerland.
Exactly. Let's shift focus there to Sandoz, a company that surprisingly didn't start in pharmaceuticals.
Right. They were a paint and dye manufacturer originally.
Correct. After World War I, they pivot. They see making medicines as a kind of logical progression from chemical dyes, specifically thiazines. And their lead chemist, Arthur Stoll, he decides to focus on ergot.
Ergot, that infamous purple fungus that grows on rye. And it's not just some simple plant remedy. This stuff has a terrifying history.
Oh, absolutely terrifying. You have to understand the historical dread surrounding ergot. Back in the Middle Ages, eating contaminated grain caused this mass illness called St. Anthony's fire.
St. Anthony's fire.
Yeah, the fungus has alkaloids that cause extreme vasoconstriction. Blood vessels clamp down so tight that blood flow stops. Fingers, toes, limbs would just turn black, die, and often need amputation without anesthetic.
Horrific. And wasn't there a psychological effect, too? Hallucinations.
Vivid, terrifying ones. Mass psychosis. Some sources even link the historical accounts of ergotism to those twisted, nightmarish figures you see in Hieronymus Bosch paintings.
Wow. Yet somehow, midwives had figured out how to use it.
Paradoxically, yes. They called it mother corn, mother grain. They used tiny, incredibly dangerous doses to help induce contractions during difficult labor and, crucially, to stop women from bleeding out after childbirth.
So Stoll's challenge was to isolate whatever made it work, right? Something the big pharma rivals hadn't managed.
Exactly. Isolate the active agent, make it safe and reliable. That was the goal.
And Stoll, he pulled it off. In March 1918, he isolates the key alkaloid, ergotamine.
Right.
And just 3 years later, it's marketed as Gainergen, a hugely successful drug for postnatal bleeding and later for severe migraines, too.
This was the breakthrough that really put Sandoz on the map globally. Gainergen was a huge success. It gave him a massive corporate presence and, importantly, an almost total monopoly on ergotamine production.
But success creates its own problems, right? They suddenly needed vast amounts of this raw material, the ergot fungus.
Exactly. Gathering it wild was just too slow, too expensive, too unreliable. So Sandoz kicks off what the sources call an agrochemical revolution in the Emmental region of Switzerland. This is the late 1930s.
The Emmental, like the cheese region.
The very same. Poor, damp area, perfect for growing rye and perfect for the fungus. And this detail is so crucial because it just flips the whole later counterculture image on its head.
How so?
LSD didn't come from some, quaint organic farm. It was born from hyper-modern, profit-driven industrial agriculture. Sandoz actually convinced these poor farmers to stop growing nourishing rye grain and instead cultivate the historically hated ergot.
Why would they do that?
Money. Sandoz offered them several times the price they'd get for the rye itself.
And Sandoz controlled the whole process.
Every single step. They provided patented rye seeds, Cluserragen special, specifically bred to be easily infected by the fungus. They supplied the Sandoz-produced fertilizers, the pesticides, everything to maximize the yield of infected grain.
Wow, it sounds incredibly controlled.
And then there's the labor. They hired young local women, Emmentaler girls, gave them special inoculation guns.
Inoculation guns.
Yeah. They had to walk the fields and manually shoot the mycelium, the fungal threads, directly into the flowering buds of the rye plants. To guarantee a reliable mass infection, it was industrial farming applied to a parasite.
So the very foundation of LSD was this high-tech, corporate, profit-focused venture, the absolute opposite of the whole back-to-nature hippie ideal it got linked with later.
Completely opposite. And it was this massive industrialized stockpile of ergot that led them straight to Albert Hofmann.
Hofmann, Stoss chemist, he synthesizes lysergic acid dithylamide, LSD-25, back in 1938, using lysergic acid from that ergotamine stockpile.
Right, but the initial tests, they were looking for circulatory effects, similar to Gainergen. And the results just seemed, well, uninteresting, pharmacologically speaking. So he just shelved it, put it aside.
For 5 years. Then, 1943, he comes back to LSD-25. Why then?
It wasn't just random curiosity. The company was actively pushing its chemists to find new products they could derive from that huge ergot stockpile they'd created. They needed to justify this massive agrochemical operation.
Makes sense. And this leads to April 16th, 1943, the big moment.
The pivotal moment. The dramatic self-experiment, as Hoffman called it. He's working with LSD-25, and he somehow accidentally absorbs a tiny amount. He's suspected maybe through his fingertips or perhaps inhaling dust.
And what happened?
He starts feeling this strange restlessness, dizziness, couldn't focus. He had to stop work and bike home.
Okay.
And at home, it hits him fully. This intense but not unpleasant intoxication. He describes seeing fantastical images of extraordinary plasticity, just constantly shifting shapes in intense kaleidoscopic colors.
Wow. So he knew something potent was going on.
Definitely. He was determined to figure it out. So 3 days later, April 19th, he decides to do the first intentional experiment. He measures out what he thinks is a tiny threshold dose, 250 micrograms.
250 micrograms, which we now know is actually a pretty hefty dose, right?
A very substantial recreational dose. He had absolutely no idea how incredibly potent it was.
So what was that intentional trip like?
It hit him hard and fast. Dizziness, blurred vision, uncontrollable fits of laughter. He looks around his lab, the familiar instruments, the centrifuges, they all start morphing into monsters in his perception. His colleagues' work seemed utterly meaningless.
And this is when the famous bicycle ride happens.
That's right, bicycle day. He feels he absolutely has to get home. His lab assistant, Suzanne Ramstein, goes with him. He describes pedaling like crazy, feeling like he's stuck in one spot, not moving at all.
Yeah.
Yet Ramstein later said she could barely keep up with him. He was flying, subjectively stuck, but objectively racing. Total perceptual warp.
That sounds terrifying, honestly. What happened when he got home?
He was convinced he'd poisoned himself. He apparently drank the entire contents of their ice box full of milk, trying to counteract it.
Milk.
And then the really strong visuals kick in. His neighbor came over with the family doctor. Hoffman saw the neighbor as a many-colored monster, a witch. He felt his own body was metallic, alien, disconnected. Just profound psychological chaos.
But physically.
That was the key. The doctor checked him over, pulse, heart rate, breathing, completely normal. Physically, he was fine.
And that's when Hoffman realized.
Exactly. He realized this substance had this unique, unbelievable power and efficiency. He later calculated it was about 1,000 times stronger than Provitin, that Nazi stimulant.
1,000 times stronger.
His bosses at Sandoz, they were totally skeptical at first. They thought he must have made some huge error calculating the dose. They just couldn't believe such a tiny amount could have such a massive effect.
But he hadn't made a mistake.
Nope. LSD was officially the most potent substance heretofore known, and Sandoz had it. Now, the war ends not long after Hoffman's discovery, and the U.S. military immediately kicks off Operation Alsos, this huge effort to grab German scientific secrets, technology, know-how.
Right, getting hold of rocket scientists, nuclear physicists.
And biochemists. This quickly turned into a hunt for the ultimate psychological weapon, the perfect truth drug.
And this is where LSD starts its slide from potential medicine to secret weapon.
Pretty much the beginning of the end for its innocence, yeah. The sources talk about U.S. Medical Corps Captain Carlo Huns. He's an expert in biochemical weapons, and he's specifically looking for a truth serum for interrogations.
Okay, and who does he find?
He connects with the former top Nazi chemist, Richard Kuhn. Kuhn was actually facing the Nuremberg tribunal for his war work. Huns offers him the classic Cold War deal. Tell us what you cooperate, and we'll help you avoid prosecution.
And Kuhn talked. What did he reveal?
Chilling stuff. The U.S. got their hands on secret Nazi documents. Records of experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners. They were using mescaline, other drugs, trying to achieve what the documents called chemical methods for the neutralization of the will.
Neutralization of the will, basically breaking people's minds to force confessions.
Exactly. Breaking the ego, making them compliant, extracting information against their will, pure pharmacological interrogation.
And this knowledge was considered valuable.
So valuable and so sensitive, particularly the methods, that the U.S. military actually suppressed these documents, kept them out of the official Nuremberg doctor's trial.
Why?
They decided the information was too strategically important for the brewing Cold War with the Soviets to let it become public knowledge. So LSD, just by association with this hunt for mind drugs, gets earmarked as a potential tool.
And then the military makes a direct approach to Sandoz.
In 1948, yeah. Brigadier General Charles E. Lux from the U.S. Army Chemical Center visits Sandoz in Switzerland. He meets Arthur Stoll's son, Werner, and gets a sample of LSD.
And he's thinking of it as a weapon.
Explicitly, as a potential non-lethal weapon, something to disorient enemy troops on a battlefield maybe, or to help soften up subjects in interrogations.
This military interest then catches the eye of the CIA.
It explodes after CIA Director Allen Dulles gives this speech in 1953. Dulles was completely consumed by paranoia about the Soviets. He believed they were mastering brain warfare, developing brain perversion techniques.
Brain warfare?
Yeah. So he launches the notorious MKUltra program. Its whole goal was to master these same techniques, to figure out how to condition the human mind so it reacts not rationally, but to impulses implanted from outside. Total mind control fantasy.
And LSD becomes central to MKUltra.
Absolutely. The CIA moves fast to get a monopoly. The guy in charge of this was Sidney Gottlieb. He was actually a bacteriologist, heading up the Special Operations Division, SOD, at Camp Detrick, the military's bioweapons facility.
So Gottlieb's job is to corner the market on LSD.
Pretty much. And you can see Sandoz getting really nervous around this time.
Okay.
Their U.S. subsidiary manager writes back to Haussmann in Switzerland, saying the company's getting cold feet about LSD because of all the extreme external interest from authorized and unauthorized people.
And then the CIA literally shows up with cash.
Suitcase full. $240,000 in cash. They initially tried to order a massive amount, 10 kilograms. That's 100 million doses.
100 million?
Stoll had to explain they'd only made about 40 grams total up to that point, maybe 4 million doses. So the CIA just bought the entire existing stock on the spot.
Wow. And Sandoz agreed to this.
Stoll made a crucial agreement. He promised he'd keep the U.S. authorities informed about any other large orders, especially if they came from the Eastern Bloc.
That sealed its fate, didn't it?
Completely. It transferred LSD from the realm of pharmaceutical research straight into the world of secret weapons. And Sandoz, seeing the writing on the wall, promptly withdrew its application to the FDA for LSD approval as a medicine.
So Gottlieb gets his LSD. What does he do with it?
He starts these extensive and often incredibly reckless experiments, dosing colleagues, agents, military personnel.
Yeah.
Sometimes they knew, sometimes, and this is deeply unethical, they didn't. Unwitting dosing.
What were the results like?
Pretty unpredictable, according to the reports.
Yeah.
You had these supposedly tough, case-hardened agents breaking down in tears or getting suddenly all gooey about the brotherhood of man after a trip. Apparently, getting dosed without knowing became a kind of occupational hazard within the CIA.
An occupational hazard? That sounds insane.
And for one man, that hazard turned deadly. Frank Olson. He was a bacteriologist working with Gottlieb at Camp Detrick.
Okay.
In 1953, he's at this brainstorming retreat at a place called Deep Creek Lake. They're discussing assassination methods, exotic poisons like saxitoxin, botulinum toxin. And during this session, Olson is secretly dosed with LSD in his drink.
Unwittingly dosed during a meeting about assassination.
Exactly. And Olson reacted incredibly badly. He became extremely paranoid, agitated. And the situation immediately turned into a massive security nightmare because Olson started shouting at Gottlieb, revealing top-secret information about U.S. biological weapons program.
Oh, no. Like what?
Highly classified stuff. Details about how the U.S. program was using intelligence gathered from the notorious Japanese Unit 731, those scientists who did horrific experiments on prisoners, but were given immunity by the U.S. in exchange for their data.
Wow.
Olson also knew about a massive U.S. order for anthrax bombs. He knew too much, and now he was unstable. He was basically a walking, talking security breach.
So what did the CIA do?
Days later, Olson is in New York City, supposedly under CIA-arranged psychiatric care. He's sharing a room at the Statler Hotel with Robert Lashbrook, Gottlieb's deputy, the guy who actually spiked his Cointreau with LSD.
Okay.
And Olson falls to his death from the 10th floor window.
Or was pushed.
The circumstances are still incredibly murky, heavily debated. The official story was suicide. But Olson had told his wife just before he died that he'd made a terrible mistake, and he was convinced the CIA was going to kill him. The link to the CIA's ruthless drug experiments and the security breach is undeniable. It's a very dark chapter.
That's truly chilling. A potential medicine gets hijacked as a weapon, leads to unethical experiments, and then potentially murder, all tangled up in Cold War paranoia.
It shows how high the stakes were and how far things had strayed from Hoffman's original hopes.
And yet, despite the CIA trying to lock it all down, the genie was already sort of out of the bottle, wasn't it? The drug still leaped out.
It did. Ironically, Gottlieb's own strategy of distributing it for testing to academics, military researchers inadvertently seeded the ground. It spread through the university research community. Yeah, the CIA actually funded over 149 sub-projects, spread across something like 150 universities and research institutions.
And the scientists didn't know it was CIA money.
Often not. The funding came through these front organizations, charitable foundations set up by the CIA, so many researchers were unknowingly part of the MKUltra network.
Like Henry K. Beecher at Harvard. He was involved in LSD studies.
He was. Beecher was actually the world's first professor of anesthesiology. He became infamous later for exposing unethical human experimentation, but back then he was doing LSD studies and arguing that man was the ideal experimental animal. Shows the ethical climate of the time.
Meanwhile, the people who first saw its potential, like Hoffman and Aldous Huxley, they had a very different vision.
Completely different. They corresponded a lot. Hoffman, Huxley. They thought LSD not as a weapon or even a mass drug, but as a profound tool for psychotherapy. Maybe for unlocking creativity, but really for a select cultural elite, artists, writers, scientists, not for weekend parties.
But that idea of keeping it contained, it gets blown wide open by mushrooms, doesn't it?
The magic mushroom revelation, yeah. 1957. R. Gordon Wasson, who was, believe it or not, a vice president at J.P. Morgan Bank.
Up in banker.
A banker and amateur mycologist. He travels down to Oaxaca, Mexico, meets the Mazatec shaman Maria Sabina, and participates in a traditional sacred mushroom ceremony.
And then he writes about it.
Publishes this huge, sensational article in Life magazine. It described his profound, mystical experience, and the sources say it landed like a bombshell on American culture. Suddenly, everyone's talking about psychedelic experiences.
And here's another bizarre twist. Wasson's trip, the one that launched popular psychedelia, it was partly funded by the CIA.
Unbelievably, yes.
Wow.
The funding came through one of Sidney Gottlieb's MK Ultra organizations. The CIA, trying to control mind-altering substances, accidentally bankrolled the very thing that spread awareness across America.
You couldn't make it up. And Hoffman gets involved again here.
Yeah, Wasson sends mushroom samples to Hoffman. Hoffman isolates the active compound in 1958, psilocybin. Sandoz quickly turns it into a pill, calls it indocybin. Another potential therapeutic, bites the dust, essentially.
So the counterculture picks up on all this.
They run with it. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, he had actually been one of those unwitting MK Ultra test subjects earlier. Paid $75 for his first LSD trip at a VA hospital.
Right.
He uses the royalties from his book to fund what he called the Revolt of the Guinea Pigs, which basically meant the acid tests.
The acid tests, these legendary parties with the painted bus, further.
Exactly. Massive events traveling across the country centered around LSD, music, lights, introducing thousands of people to the experience.
And then you have Timothy Leary, the Harvard psychologist. He really takes it mainstream, doesn't he?
Oh, Leary becomes the high priest of LSD. In the early 60s, he places this absolutely enormous order with Sandoz. 100 grams of LSD and 25 kilograms of psilocybin.
25 kilos of psilocybin. What's the value on that?
Nearly 2 million Swiss francs at the time.
Huh?
A huge amount.
Sandoz must have been happy, but also nervous, given their deal with the CIA.
Extremely nervous. They were thrilled by the sale, sure, but they needed cast iron assurances that Leary's research was officially sanctioned by the U.S. government. Because of that secret agreement Stoll had made years before.
And Leary's style, his whole turn-on, tune-in, drop-out thing, that didn't sit well with the original researchers.
Not at all. Leary's relentless publicity-seeking, his almost Carnival Barker approach. It totally alienated Hoffman, Huxley, Humphrey Osmond, the British psychiatrist who coined the term psychedelic. They were horrified.
Why?
They felt Leary was completely discrediting this serious scientific potential, turning this profound tool into a kind of frivolous recreational drug fad, undoing all the careful groundwork they tried to lay.
There's a fascinating, almost hidden political angle here, too, involving Leary and JFK.
Yeah, Leary had a connection, a woman named Mary Pinchot Meyer. She was a painter, an intellectual, and rumored to be one of JFK's lovers. She was also a pacifist and interested in psychedelics.
And she talked to Kennedy about this.
Apparently, yes. She encouraged him to look inward, suggesting that maybe these substances could help foster peace, open his mind to nonviolent solutions to the Cold War.
Is there any evidence this influenced him?
It's tantalizingly circumstantial.
Yeah.
But just months before he was assassinated, Kennedy gave this really remarkable speech at American University. It's often called his peace speech.
What did he say?
He sounded incredibly reflected, very different from typical Cold War rhetoric. He urged Americans to begin by looking inward, saying our problems are man-made, therefore they can be solved by man. The timing after these reported conversations with Meyer is, well, suggestive.
Wow. But whatever potential influence there might have been, the political tide was already turning hard against LSD.
Definitely. By 1966, Sandoz had had enough. The legal headaches, the ethical controversies fueled by Leary. They issued a worldwide recall of all LSD and psilocybin samples. Pull the plug.
And the U.S. government cracks down hard.
Draconian laws start coming in. The Narcotics Control Act of 1956 already had harsh mandatory minimums. Then amendments in 65 tightened things further. But the real hammer comes down with Richard Nixon.
Nixon declares the war on drugs.
Elected in 68, he ramps up the rhetoric massively.
Yeah.
These powders and pills, he declared, threaten our nation's health, vitality, and self-respect. It becomes a central theme of his presidency.
And this leads to one of the weirdest moments in presidential history, the Elvis Presley meeting.
Oh, the Elvis-Nixon meeting in 1970. It's legendary for its sheer strangeness. Elvis shows up at the White House, unannounced, basically, wearing this wild crimson suit, amber sunglasses, huge gold belt buckle.
What did he want?
He wanted Nixon to give him an official badge, make him a federal agent at large for the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs.
Elvis wanted to be a narc.
Apparently, he goes on this rant to Nixon, denouncing the Beatles as anti-American. He says things like, violence, drug usage, dissent, protest all seem to merge in the same group, meaning the counterculture kids using psychedelics.
And Nixon buys it.
Nixon, always the opportunist, totally laps it up. Sees Elvis as this symbol of patriotism fighting the degenerate drug culture. He gives him the badge.
But the irony, Elvis himself.
The terrible, painful irony. Elvis, railing against drug use, would be dead just 6.5 years later, age 42. Not from LSD or pot, but from a massive overdose of prescription drugs. polypharmacy addiction.
How bad was his addiction?
The sources are shocking. In the last 8 months of his life alone, his doctors prescribed him over 10,000 doses of sedatives, amphetamines, opioids. 10,000.
That just highlights the hypocrisy, doesn't it? Focusing all the fire on counterculture drugs while ignoring a massive prescription pill crisis.
Exactly. It shows the misdirection, maybe the deliberate misdirection, of the whole war on drugs narrative.
So prohibition is in full swing, Sandoz is out, research is shut down, but that doesn't mean LSD disappears, right?
Not at all. Prohibition never stops demand, it just pushes it underground. And that creates an opening for people like Owsley Stanley, nicknamed the Bear.
Owsley Stanley, he becomes the big underground chemist.
The chemist laureate of the counterculture, basically. Grandson of a Kentucky governor, interestingly. He wasn't just cooking it up. He solved the problem of scale for the black market.
Oh.
He industrialized underground production. He synthesized LSD with incredible precision. Reports say his stuff was 99% pure, apparently even better quality than Hoffman's original Sandoz batches.
Yeah, better than the original.
And he had the network to distribute it. He was deeply involved with the Grateful Dead, helped bankroll them, worked as their sound engineer.
So the Dead concerts became the distribution network.
Essentially, yeah. Grateful Dead shows became the new acid tests, but for a much larger audience. Stanley's high-purity acid flooded the scene, cementing that link between LSD and the whole counterculture movement for decades to come.
Okay, let's jump forward quite a bit now into what people are calling the psychedelic renaissance. Albert Hoffman, he lived an incredibly long life, didn't he?
He did, lived to be 100. And he published his memoir, LSD, My Problem Child.
And what was his take, looking back?
He largely blamed the mass recreational party use for the drug's criminalization. He felt that kind of consumption was just irreconcilable with the deep and mystical experience that he believed LSD could offer. He saw it more as a tool for profound ecological insight, maybe spiritual oneness.
He worried about something he called taboo, right? Not meaning forbidden, but...
Right, not a ban, but the lack of cultural guardrails. He felt modern Western society just didn't have the rituals, the ethical frameworks, the sort of societal containers that maybe some indigenous cultures had developed over centuries to handle these incredibly powerful substances responsibly.
And that lack of taboo is something today's researchers are trying to address, perhaps.
I think that's a big part of the modern scientific revival, yeah. Trying to build that responsible framework. And this revival is really being driven by advances in modern brain science, especially the work on neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, form new connections. How does LSD fit into that?
Well, researchers like Professor Franz Vollenweider in Zurich, using modern brain imaging like fMRI and PET scans, they've shown how these substances work on a molecular level.
Okay.
LSD, psilocybin, they primarily activate specific serotonin receptors in the brain, particularly the 5-HT2A receptor.
And why is that receptor important?
It's highly significant because these 5-HT2A receptors are the very ones that tend to decrease in number or become less active in people with neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
Ah, interesting. So what actually happens in the brain when these receptors are activated by, say, LSD?
Vollenweider's work shows a couple of key things. First, it affects the thalamus. Think of it as the brain's sensory relay station or gatekeeper.
Right.
Normally, the thalamus filters the flood of sensory information coming in, only letting it trickle through to the cortex. Under psychedelics, that gate seems to open up much wider. More sensory data gets through, which confirms Aldous Huxley's old idea of the doors of perception.
Okay, more sensory input. What else?
At the same time, activity decreases in what's called a default mode network. This network is often associated with our sense of self, our ego, that internal narrative that's always running, categorizing, worrying, planning.
So the ego gets quieter.
Essentially, yes. It receives less energy. And when the DMN quiets down, other more peripheral brain regions can become more active and start communicating with each other in unusual ways. New connections form, temporarily at least.
And how could that be therapeutic?
It seems to allow the brain to break out of rigid, unhealthy patterns of thinking, like the constant negative rumination you see in depression, or the obsessive thought loops in addiction or OCD. It shakes up the snow globe, lets new patterns emerge.
So for depression, for example.
Vollenweider suggests that this shift can activate parts of the frontal cortex involved in positive memory retrieval. It helps patients access positive feelings and maybe put negative experiences or traumas at a greater distance, making them less overwhelming. It's not about artificial happiness, but about restructuring how the brain processes difficult content.
This sounds like it could have huge implications. And it connects to the current interest in microdosing too, right?
Absolutely. There's a massive amount of anecdotal buzz about microdosing, taking tiny subperceptual doses.
Subperceptual meaning you don't actually feel high.
Exactly, you don't trip. But the idea is that even these tiny doses might be enough to gently stimulate neuroplasticity, to subtly reorganize some of those neural networks over time.
Is there solid clinical proof for microdosing yet?
The large-scale, rigorous clinical data is still coming in. It's complex to study, but there are preliminary indications, particularly from brain imaging, suggesting effects on functional connectivity, especially in areas like the amygdala and limbic system regions, crucial for emotion, fear, memory processing.
The sources we looked at included a really powerful personal story about microdosing related to Alzheimer's.
Yes, the account of the author whose mother was suffering from Alzheimer's. It really brings the human struggle against the current system into sharp focus.
They were facing this grim prognosis, right? The German Center for Neurodegenerative Diseases basically said an effective treatment was maybe 20 years away.
20 years. Imagine hearing that. You're watching someone you love decline, and the medical establishment offers nothing concrete for decades. It breeds a certain desperation.
And that led them to consider microdosing LSD, despite the legal risks and ethical concerns.
It did. The sources describe this agonizing ethical dilemma. They wrestled with the Nuremberg Code, the absolute requirement for voluntary, informed consent for any human experimentation. How do you get that from someone with dementia?
A huge ethical minefield.
But they ultimately did proceed, carefully obtaining the mother's consent as best they could, even though she was initially skeptical about taking any medicine prescribed for sick people. They started adding a tiny, precise dose, 12.5 micrograms of LSD dissolved in her coffee on certain days.
12.5 micrograms, that's really small.
Very small, well below the thresholds for a noticeable trip. And the results they described were quite striking.
What happened?
On the day she got the microdose, the mother reportedly became much more animated, brighter, more engaged, less lethargic. It seemed to act almost like a cognitive stimulant for her.
And longer term.
Even more profound, according to the account. After about 5 months on this microdosing regimen, the mother apparently took a shower voluntarily for the first time in a year.
Wow.
And amazingly, she also started trying to read the newspaper aloud again, sounding out difficult words, something she hadn't been able to do as the disease progressed, likely due to that atrophy in the 5-HT2A receptors and general cognitive decline.
That's an incredible anecdote. Obviously, it's just one case, but it really highlights the potential that people are seeing and the frustration with the current barriers.
It absolutely does, and it underscores this massive final hurdle. Getting these substances legally approved as medicines. The path is incredibly complex and astronomically expensive.
How expensive are we talking?
The kind of large-scale, Phase 3 clinical trials needed to satisfy regulators like the FDA or EMA. They can cost anywhere from $500 million to potentially $1 billion for a single substance for a specific indication.
$500 million to $1 billion. Just to prove safety and efficacy for a drug, Sandoz found non-addictive and relatively safe decades ago. Why is that bar so incredibly high?
It's the legacy of prohibition. It's not just about the science anymore. It's about overcoming decades of political opposition, stigma, fear. The sources describe the ban as being like a biochemical wall that the government puts up inside people's heads.
The biochemical wall.
Yeah, denying access to molecules that current science suggests could offer profound healing, could broaden perception. That massive cost is needed not just for the science, but to dismantle decades of ideological baggage built on the fears of Anslinger, Dulles, and Nixon. So we've covered this incredible, almost unbelievable path, haven't we? From a chemist's accidental bike ride in Basel to the shadow influence of ex-Gestapo agents on U.S. drug laws. Through the dark corridors of CIA safe houses and the tragedy of Frank Olson. And now, arriving at these potentially cosmic breakthroughs happening in university labs in places like Zurich, it's quite a story.
It really is. And the central tragedy, the painful historical irony here, is that all this potential seems to have been lost, or at least delayed for decades, not because the drug itself was proven medically dangerous.
Right. Sandoz's early work found no real risk of addiction, no major physical harm.
But because it got caught up in politics, its perceived value as a Cold War weapon, and then its role as a symbol of counterculture dissent. We basically sacrificed potentially decades of medical progress because of ideology and fear.
Which brings us right back to Albert Hoffman's deep worry, that concern he had about modern society lacking the right taboo.
The cultural container, the ethical framework.
Exactly. Not a prohibition, but a way to integrate these powerful substances wisely. And that worry feels incredibly relevant right now, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. If science actually succeeds, if they manage to raise the billions needed, navigate the regulatory maze, and bring psychedelic medicine back into the mainstream, the challenge doesn't end there.
No, that's really just the beginning of a new challenge. The truly profound task then becomes developing those missing social, cultural, ethical frameworks, the new taboo, if you will.
How do we make sure this time, this opportunity for potentially profound healing, for new understanding, how do we ensure it isn't misused or trivialized or shut down again by fear?
That's the crucial question. The next step has to be about building an approach that's guided by careful science, by compassion, by ethics,
Right.
and not by the politically charged, often irrational fears of the past. That, I think, is the great challenge and the great opportunity facing us now as a free society.